We are used to thinking of pleasure as something good. But what if pleasure could be used as an instrument of social and philosophical torture? This is the terrifying idea explored by Aldous Huxley in his phenomenal novel Brave New World. It frequently appears on lists of the best books of the 20th century, and a close reading reveals a philosophical depth unmatched by almost any other dystopian novel. While other visions of fictional totalitarian regimes focus on the suffering caused by state repression, in Brave New World, almost everyone is happy. They live in a hedonistic paradise, yet they remain permanently disconnected from any kind of emotional or philosophical depth. Nearly all citizens experience superficial happiness, but a few souls choose to rebel. As always, keep in mind that this is just my interpretation, and there is much I won't be able to cover. But let's begin with a synopsis of the novel and an overview of the society in this new world. Brave New World is set in a post-war version of Earth, where a global government has taken control, ruled by 10 governors who bear the title of controllers. The policies of this world state are entirely centered on stability and pleasure. This dictates almost every decision the controllers make, from their legislation on birth to their extensive drug programs and planetary culture. The citizens of this new world are all artificially created by the state inside an incubator. From this moment on, each person's fate is sealed. They are immediately separated into classes ranging from Alpha Plus to Epsilon, and the letter they bear will dictate their entire lives, from the education they receive to the jobs they will have and their social status. The Alpha Plus individuals will become the future scientists, leaders, and elites of the world, while Deltas and Epsilons will be trapped in servile tasks. Depending on the class to which an embryo belongs, it is either provided with an ideal environment to nurture its future physical and psychological development, or deliberately hindered through the application of alcohol and other solutions designed to impair its intellect and body later in life. Once children are born, they are raised by the state, and the concept of mothers and fathers is entirely forbidden. Every child belongs to the government, and each one is psychologically conditioned to hold specific beliefs about culture, society, and the other classes. Alphas are taught to look down on deltas and epsilons, while deltas and epsilons are conditioned to revere alphas, but always from a distance. Once they grow up, happiness-inducing drugs called soma are readily available on demand, and anyone feeling sad or upset is encouraged to take some to restore their former peace of mind. Misery is extremely frowned upon, and the idea of understanding empathy is considered outdated. The story of Brave New World follows Lenina Crown, Bernard Marx, and Helmholtz Watson as they deal with the arrival of John the Savage, someone born outside the world state. The plot truly begins when Bernard takes Lenina on a vacation to a savage reservation. These reservations are the few places in the world not conquered by the world state, where small tribal communities live. There, Bernard meets John, who will later be known as John the Savage, and his mother, Linda, who was a citizen of the world state but was accidentally left behind during a previous expedition. Bernard agrees to take both of them back so they can see the great civilization John has always heard about. At first, this works wonderfully. Bernard gains significant social status for having discovered this unique anomaly, and John explores the world. Bernard, a psychologist, is fascinated by how differently John's mind functions, having been raised outside the state. Helmholtz, who works in propaganda, longs for art as a free and passionate expression. He becomes captivated by John's chaotic experiences in the reservation and by the forbidden works of Shakespeare. Linda, John's mother, decides to spend the rest of her life in a drug-induced semi-coma in one of the government hospitals. A decision that is widely approved by everyone except John, who considers such artificial happiness abominable. However, the drugs soon overwhelm Linda's system, and her lungs begin to fail. John rushes to her side in tears, but his grief, along with his repeated insistence that she is his mother and that he loves her, causes a public scandal. Everyone in the world state is conditioned to view death as a fairly insignificant event, and to consider natural birth morally abhorrent. Children are taken on tours around the dying to condition them to death, and when someone is no longer useful to the state, they are not regarded as having much value anyway. John's unpredictable behavior and natural expressions of suffering are perceived as disturbing to society. As a result, John, Bernard, and Helmholtz are brought before Mustafa Mond, one of the 10 world controllers. Mustafa and John engage in a fascinating philosophical dialogue about the value of different aspects of human experience. Mustafa exiles Bernard and Helmholtz to one of the many islands where the state sends those with thoughts original enough to be considered dangerous, while allowing John to go free. After being reintegrated into society, John settles in a lighthouse, seeking to be a living counterpoint to the hedonistic values of the New World. He adopts a deliberately primitive lifestyle, rejecting any symbols of the civilization he so despises. However, his retreat soon becomes a spectacle for the public. His presence turns into a curiosity, and the crowd refuses to leave him alone. Deprived even of the small respite of solitude, John ultimately takes his own life. This may have been his final act of rebellion, but in any case, the man from the wilderness, the only living person who could serve as a true counterexample to the world state, is dead. And the happy world continues unchanged and immutable, propelled by the weight of its own inertia. But let us begin by examining the underlying philosophy of the controllers. After all, with differences in thought could come differences in action, and with differences in action could arise social conflict and upheaval. How could they tolerate the possibility of a thinker like Dostoevsky or Nietzsche in a world where stability is valued above all else? The mere notion of a revolutionary idea or a revolutionary thinker is destabilizing. And why should we care about them in the first place? I mean, if everyone is generally happy, why should the individual matter? Most of the time, when we ask whether something is worthwhile, many of us tend to judge it based on whether it promotes human well-being. This is often the line of argument people use to support the notion of existential individuality as well. According to them, any attempt to kill the individual within us will leave us feeling empty and dissatisfied. We may try to assimilate into a crowd or a public identity, but there will always be this lingering sense that we have betrayed ourselves. What makes Brave New World so fascinating is that this argument supposedly no longer applies. We are presented with no evidence that the notion of individuality makes anyone in the world state any happier. At this point, they do not feel the need to be individuals. They are content in their class positions and live lives that provide them with more hedonistic pleasure than any of us will ever experience. And yet, it still seems as though something is missing. The loss of the individual feels like a great tragedy, even when no one is suffering because of it. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle believed that the ultimate human good was eudaimonia, or flourishing. This was a pleasant and fulfilling state that someone achieved when they truly lived according to reason and virtue. In Brave New World, we see these philosophies clash regarding the value of ourselves as unique individuals. We cannot be brave if there is no danger, and we cannot be magnanimous if we are not allowed to form attachments with others. In Brave New World, all of this complexity in ethics and character is reduced to maximizing pleasure, but there is a real question of whether this is a sufficient justification for abolishing our idiosyncrasies. It is quite common for a dystopia to strip people of what makes them essentially themselves and absorb each individual into a broader idea of the public. But what makes this work so brilliant is that, at first glance, this loss of uniqueness seems to have made everyone happier. While you might look at 1984 and say that, obviously, the lack of individuality is part of the reason why the citizens are suffering, in Huxley's novel, they are not suffering. And we must genuinely ask whether uniqueness is worth a loss of pleasure. Where other dystopian fiction defends individuality in utilitarian terms, Huxley attacks the very starting premise of utilitarianism by presenting us with a situation in which we have given up our individuality for greater happiness, and now we must ask whether it was worth it. In The Republic by Plato, the old philosopher has a mission very similar to that of the world controllers in Brave New World. He wants to create a society that is stable and just, and he divides the state into different classes to achieve this. For Plato, there is the bronze class, the silver class, and the gold class. The bronze class would be the city's industry, the silver class would form its army, and the gold class would be his infamous philosopher kings, ruling from above. Plato also wanted his citizens of the bronze class to enjoy their roles. In Huxley's world, this Platonic idea has been taken to the extreme. As I mentioned earlier, there is a rigid system of biological classes based on the nutrition someone receives as an embryo, and as soon as this is done, each class is conditioned to know and love its place. The deltas and epsilons are deliberately made unintelligent through the hatchery's interventions, and are conditioned throughout their education to love their work. In our world, such arguments are, rightfully, seen as highly condescending and out of place. But that is partly because nearly everyone can learn new things and become far more knowledgeable, skilled, and intelligent than they already are. Even the most ardent and extreme believers in fixed limits of intelligence do not think that people cannot learn or grow. But in Huxley's world, there is truly no possibility of growth for the deltas or epsilons, which complicates the ethical question. We are presented with a society that is profoundly unequal and paradoxically meritocratic. Everyone ends up where they can reach according to their abilities, but these opportunities are predetermined from birth. While this may lead to a situation of apparent happiness, our moral intuition suggests that injustice does not lie in the consequences, but in the structure itself. Philosophers like Spinoza and Schopenhauer are just two among many determinists who believe that our lives and decisions are predetermined, influenced by factors such as childhood traumas or family histories. The deterministic class system in Huxley's novel is an exaggerated and sharp reflection of how, in theory, the universe already determines many aspects of our lives from an early age, even though we have no control over them. We may not be living in an extremely controlled system like Huxley's world, but we often overlook how our own environment functions in a way similar to the controllers in their breeding system. In Brave New World, people know what is limiting their choices. But do we know what is limiting ours? Do we truly understand to what extent we can take credit for our position in life, considering how much external causal factors beyond our control have intervened? In a letter, Kafka describes that he and his novels are inseparable. This statement reflects the typical intensity of artistic life, but also highlights something fundamental to personal fulfillment: the ability to create. When John arrives in the futuristic society, he discovers that Shakespeare's works were among the few things people could read in the reservation, but they are banned in the world state. When he goes to an entertainment venue with Lenina and sees a fully immersive film, he is horrified by the superficiality of the art he encounters. The plots are predictable, the characters are simple, they neither challenge nor reveal anything significant, they do not encourage reflection or raise interesting questions. And this frustration with art is shared by the propagandist Helmholtz. Helmholtz desperately wants to create art, but despite being one of the deepest thinkers anyone has ever met in the world state, he cannot summon any depth. When he encounters Shakespeare's works through John, he is astonished by the creativity on display. This is what has been missing in his life, but his programming is so deeply ingrained that he cannot even fully appreciate it. This saddens John because he realizes that not only has Helmholtz been made incapable of creating expressive works, but his very ability to see and recognize depths of emotion or passion has been entirely stripped from him. This dialogue about art and creativity reaches its climax in the conversation between John and Mustafa at the end of the novel. John laments the state of art in the New World, and Mustafa surprisingly agrees. He says that nothing they create or even could create compares to Shakespeare. According to him, art can only exist through suffering and struggle. For Mustafa, extreme creativity can only exist as long as there is war, famine, disease, pain, loss, and grief. But he and the other world controllers have worked hard to eliminate these things. There is no need for art, and for Mustafa, this is not a cause for despair, but a bittersweet celebration. To him, the death of creativity is a small price to pay for a world without pain. What Mustafa does not understand is that, in a moment of creativity, we become one with our work while maintaining our individuality. For others like Kafka, art is partly an expression of something internal, a way to communicate with the world and with other people, those aspects of ourselves that we cannot put into direct words. The Russian writer and philosopher Fyodor Dostoevsky once said that one of the unbearable things about life in his prison camp was his inability to put pen to paper. He was constantly filled with ideas that screamed to be expressed, but his will was frustrated, and many people feel this to some extent. With all this in mind, a crucial question arises. Are the citizens of Brave New World happy in the broadest sense? Or are they disconnected from some of life's deepest joys due to their inability to exercise these internal creative impulses? Characteristically, this work leaves us with multiple questions. But the issues do not end there. Some of the greatest stories in history have focused on love and its earthly companion, loss. Literature about love revolves around the idea that we seek to merge with another person in some way. For example, in the Bible, this is expressed as becoming one flesh. It is therefore remarkable that in Brave New World, the controllers have attempted to eliminate this desire within us, conditioning us not to have it. Instead of the longing to merge with another, there is the axiom that everyone belongs to everyone else, and love is entirely free. In the world state, the word free means without restrictions. Making love is considered almost as trivial as any other activity. Even Lenina herself is seen as strange for having slightly committed impulses, as she singularly fixates on John. Her friends and other citizens find this utterly bizarre. To them, love and sexual acts do not imply genuine affection, but merely a simple recreational activity with no deeper meaning. The view of love in the world state is intriguing because it combines a deeply individualistic approach with a strong collectivist component. Although it appears to offer freedom, it actually limits emotional depth. Everyone can possess and be possessed superficially, but real, meaningful connections are forbidden. Even though everyone belongs to everyone, they ultimately become mere objects of consumption for personal pleasure. This apparent freedom becomes an illusion when real choices are absent. In this new world, connection has been completely replaced by consumption. Fundamental commitment is prohibited. Committing to someone can lead to social ostracism and even exile. However, it is through commitment that we can experience the deepest forms of love, companionship, and more. This point is not deeper than it seems. To establish a true connection with others, we must dedicate our time, attention, and affection to them selflessly, rather than treating them as objects for our own pleasure. It is a love given and received freely, but not in the sense of freedom understood in Brave New World. In the novel, every romantic relationship is reduced to an exchange of pleasure for pleasure. This lack becomes even more insidious because love is not explicitly forbidden. Rather, it is taught to be trivial, and taking it seriously is seen as an undesirable eccentricity. The situation of having many options, but an inability to commit to anyone in particular, reminds me of what Kierkegaard discussed and defined as a despair caused by an excess of possibilities. Sometimes, postponing investment in a choice affects us because we never commit deeply. For Kierkegaard, commitment is a necessary leap of faith to enrich our lives, even if it is terrifying and irrational. However, it is often better to commit to something than to commit to nothing at all. That said, we have spoken extensively about the carefully designed culture of the world state, and now it is time to focus on its mechanism of enforcement. A familiar method of control, isolation, and shame. Shame is a common experience, especially during adolescence, when it feels like everything you do is wrong, or you are constantly judged by others. In the hedonistic world of Brave New World, shame acts as the driving force of punishment that maintains social order. This is clearly seen in the case of Bernard Marx, a high-caste alpha and successful psychologist. Despite his status, Bernard is constantly shamed for his stature. In a society where physical size is valued as a virtue and alphas must stand above the lower classes, this difference causes Bernard deep insecurity. This small alienation also leads to his separation from society at large, prompting him to stop taking soma and to start experiencing sadness deliberately, as a small act of rebellion against the society that has marginalized him. Outwardly, he avoids any connection with this society, but inwardly, he desperately craves its acceptance. He is like a child desperately trying to get the attention of his parents after being ignored for so long. Despite its comedic nuances, I believe Bernard's experience with shame is highly insightful and one of the most underrated aspects of Huxley's novel. In a recent article, Jim E. Lang argued that shame arises from a frustrated desire to connect with others in a socially acceptable or appropriate manner. This is where the unsettling use of shame by the controllers in Brave New World becomes significant. Every child is conditioned from birth to desire socialization and companionship. In other words, the setup is perfect to make shame as painful as possible. Everyone is taught to crave social acceptance and these excessively superficial connections. But at the same time, there is only one way to achieve this desire, and if you fail to do so in the prescribed manner, then you are permanently isolated and alone. This is the existentially terrifying nature of shame. It ignites our desire for acceptance while simultaneously denying it. Brave New World communicates how powerful shame can be as a form of social control, and Huxley uses it to great effect in the unsettling dynamics of Bernard's relationships. Huxley also reminds us of the lasting effects of rejection. Bernard has faced rejection his entire life, and as a result, he becomes immensely vulnerable to betraying his principles at the first sign of acceptance. Now, let's examine Huxley's exploration of a deep and controversial human need that frequently emerges in philosophy but is rarely recognized. Throughout the New Testament, we find clear themes of sacrifice. Christ dying on the cross to redeem humanity is the most prominent example. The apostles gave up their possessions and former lives to follow Jesus. St. Paul sacrificed his livelihood to spread the word of God, and the Virgin Mary gave up her son for the good of the world. The widespread use of sacrifice as a motif is remarkable, given how potentially unpleasant it can be. By definition, a sacrifice is the renunciation of something good in service of something greater, and that is difficult to accept. Philosopher Bernard Williams speaks of categorical desires. These are things we would want to happen even if we weren't present to witness them. Intuitively, categorical desires transcend our thoughts about ourselves and our own pleasure, and reach out to the world to imbue an aspect of it with value. And the value of this idea seems closely connected to sacrifice. To have a categorical desire is, in fact, to have something outside oneself that we value as much or more than our own pleasure, which makes it very close to having something worth sacrificing for. To ground this idea, think of the mothers we know and how they say they would not only sacrifice themselves for their child, but would do so happily, without a hint of doubt or resentment in their hearts. We can observe how people show willingness, and even enthusiasm, to sacrifice in everyday life. From friends giving up a fun night to support someone going through a tough time, to children in the playground sharing their favorite toys with younger siblings. This kind of sacrificial generosity can not only bring joy to the recipient, but also to the giver. Part of the reason Brave New World feels like a dystopia is because the people there are deprived of having something for which they can sacrifice. Behind the vague notions of everyone living for others, there are very few examples of genuine sacrifice in the world state. In practice, people simply seek pleasure and avoid discomfort. If they are sad, they take soma, and if they feel desire, they simply satisfy it without thinking twice. One of the clearest examples of this comes in the relationship between John and Lenina. John is clearly attracted to Lenina, just as she is to him, but he does not want to consummate this until they are in a committed bond. This makes little sense to Lenina, but for John, the denial itself is the point. This same impulse of sacrifice is embodied in Helmholtz when he begins to act against the world state, inserting his own poetry into his propaganda lectures, despite it being forbidden. The willingness to sacrifice out of compassion for others represents the essence of human goodness. But instead of facing pain or renouncing part of our pleasure for others, the world state tends to offer quick fixes, such as mental vacations with drugs to alleviate discomfort. The act of sacrificing for someone or for a cause is now seen as socially harmful. If someone values something enough to sacrifice for it, they might even value it more than the orders coming from above. However, if we seriously consider philosophers like those mentioned earlier, we must recognize that by eliminating sacrifice, the controllers have also deprived people of a potentially meaningful and fulfilling source of life. Deep sacrifice has been replaced by superficial pleasure. In Brave New World, we don't know how many share Helmholtz and Bernard's existential emptiness, but it seems more common than Mustafa would be willing to admit. I am interested in exploring this point about pleasure, which is central to the novel and raises fascinating questions. Towards the end, the dialogue between John and Mustafa about the nature and value of pleasure is crucial. Now we will dive deeper to question the foundations of the controller's views on good governance and humanity. Unlike many dystopias, the governments in this novel appear benevolent and promote happiness and well-being with utilitarian premises that seem noble. The controllers in Brave New World make questionable philosophical assumptions, such as considering all pleasures to be equivalent. According to Mustafa Mond, happiness is measured in a linear and quantitative manner, without distinguishing between different types of pleasure. The difference between ecstasy, joy, excitement, and satisfaction is overlooked, all seen as equally calculable in a simplified vision. This perspective contrasts with the distinction John Stuart Mill made between lower pleasures, such as eating, drinking, and the physical aspect of sex, and higher pleasures, such as companionship, love, and contemplation. John's main critique of art lies in the fact that by prioritizing immediate hedonism, the controllers have deprived their citizens of deeper experiences. But John's critique goes much further, because what he desires, as Mustafa points out, is the right to be unhappy. In other words, he wants to experience the full range of the human experience and value this in itself, rather than simply desiring positive feelings all the time. The human mind is not as simple as adding up our pleasures and subtracting our pains. According to John, there is value in the push and pull of the pleasurable and unpleasant aspects of existential experience. And if we completely eliminate negativity, we will deprive ourselves of the strange satisfaction of having lived a full life. That is, if you fully engage with the willful and passionate aspects of your life, sometimes it will lead you to a temporary energetic ecstasy, but at other times, it will plunge you into misery. We can choose to dull both sides of this passion if we wish. But for nature, if we are open to one, the other will surely occur at some point. Ultimately, this is an empirical claim, and I leave it to you to decide how well grounded it is in your own experiences. John also despises the concept of soma, this drug that can induce happiness even in the most melancholic of individuals. Unlike many modern antidepressants, it has no immediate side effects, but John still sees its happiness as false in some way. Robert Nozick's thought experiment, The Experience Machine, showed that most people would reject the offer of perpetual simulated happiness, preferring a real life with its ups and downs. This suggests that there are values that humans consider more important than pure happiness. However, it raises the question, what does it mean for happiness to be false? Soma is often perceived as artificial happiness because it induces a state of fantasy. But whether generally true or not, for John, such an impulse exists quite strongly. He would rather be a suffering rebel than a happy conformist, and his impulse towards self-destruction is ultimately fulfilled when he ends his own life in his solitary lighthouse, with the scars of his self-flagellation still shining on his back. Ultimately, Brave New World challenges a deeply ingrained assumption that many of us hold, which is the belief that pleasure is always good and that more pleasure is always better. This may be true or it may be false, and partly depends on where we exactly draw the boundaries of the term pleasure. For Huxley, the controllers have narrowed the concept too much and have traded our humanity for a cheap emotion. Many thinkers have warned us that when the situation becomes difficult, rulers may resort to distraction techniques to approve unpopular or immoral decisions. Huxley reminds us that just because we are enjoying ourselves now, it doesn't mean everything is fine, and that distraction is no less effective because it is pleasurable. Thirdly, on a philosophical level, we can begin to ask ourselves what things are more valuable than pleasure, and how these could influence both our ethical system and our existential philosophy. Beyond this, we might ask whether pleasures can be empty, or if some pleasures are more morally important than others, or whether things like freedom, expression, or individuality are more important elements than pleasure. All of these questions can revitalize our philosophical interest, and they are all open yet profoundly interesting questions. Your answer to these questions will help you decide whether Brave New World is a flawed utopia or an absolute abomination that tramples all that is human in the name of a false conviction. Because, in the end, what sets Brave New World apart from other contemporary works are the unsettling questions that run throughout the book. Questions such as the following. What if the controllers are right? What if pleasure is all that exists? What if giving up art, freedom, individuality, change, love, class mobility, and solitude is worth it just to get our daily dose of happiness and enjoy simple dreams? Mustafa Mond presents himself to us as a modern Mephistopheles with an outstretched hand. But the question we all must ask ourselves is his offer really worth it? The answer to this may radically change the course of our lives. To conclude, I quote Aldous Huxley. Perhaps the greatest lesson of history is that no one learns the lessons of history.